It was late October, the kind of evening when Oxford seemed to draw its shore closer, as if guarding against the encroachment of the world beyond its cloisters. I'd taken my usual corner table at the Randolph, a poor imitation of habit mistaken for comfort, and was finishing the remains of a solitary supper. The rain had found its rhythm against the window, steady and reflective, like the slow turning of a metronome one doesn't wish to stop. I remember the crossword more vividly than the meal. An unremarkable grid except for one clue that lingered like a whisper. Fellow's undoing, perhaps, in glass or word. 6. I never did complete it. The answer would arrive, as most things did, too late. From my seat, I could see across Beaumont Street the faint outlines of the spires that led toward the older colleges. Somewhere beyond them, at St. Athanasius, another dinner was beginning. The Fellows' Table, that most hallowed of collegiate rituals, where intellect and vanity were often served together on fine china. I had attended a few such evenings in my time, though rarely twice at the same institution. There's only so much wine and mutual self-admiration one man can stomach. Yet that night, as the clock approached 10, I found myself imagining the long table lit by candles, the murmur of Latin grace, the reflection of tired ambition on silver goblets polished for the occasion. I ordered another whiskey I didn't need and opened the Oxford mail from the next morning, which had been left behind by some early riser. It was the headline, small and discreet, that caught my eye. Sudden death at St. Athanasius, college banquet. A fellow, it said, Professor Adrian Blythe, found collapsed during the port. The paper offered no drama, only the polite detachment reserved for men of rank who die inconveniently. I stared at the words longer than I should have, though I couldn't have said why. Perhaps it was the season, or the word fellow, echoing the unfinished crossword, or simply that the rain, relentless in its persistence, had made the city feel too much like memory. Blythe. The name stirred something faint. A lecture years ago on Catullus, I think, where his voice had carried the kind of bitterness only brilliance can sustain. He had been admired, envied, feared in the way men are when their intellect is sharper than their courtesy. I remembered hearing of some scandal, a young student whose thesis he had supervised too closely, but Oxford thrives on scandal as it does on tradition. Both are meant to be survived, not solved. I folded the newspaper and watched the candle on my table shrink upon itself, the last remnant of light performing its slow, inevitable retreat. A waiter cleared the empty glass and asked whether I'd like anything else. I told him no, though I lingered, unable to leave, as though movement might disturb whatever fragile symmetry the night had arranged. Outside, the pavement gleamed, that particular wetness that renders the city both more beautiful and more secretive. As I walked back toward Jericho, the rain intensified, drumming against my coat, and the air smelled faintly of smoke. Bonfires, perhaps, from early Halloween preparations. A group of students passed by in masks, their laughter briefly breaking through the weather before vanishing into the dark. It struck me that laughter in the rain always sounds like defiance. When I reached home, I poured another whiskey, though by then the act was more ceremony than pleasure. The newspaper lay folded on the table beside the crossword. I noticed, belatedly, that a drop of rain had blurred one of the clues. The ink had run just enough to turn fellow into follow. I stared at it for a long time, that small accident of water and chance, and wondered if the difference between the two words might not explain most of life. The few who lead and the many who trail behind, believing they've chosen their path. I didn't yet know that by the following afternoon I'd be standing beneath the vaulted ceiling of St. Athanasius's refectory, where the last candle of the Fellows' Table still smouldered beside a half-finished glass of port, and that a dead man's hand would be resting gently on Psalm 130, "Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord." But perhaps some part of me already suspected it. Oxford, after all, has a way of whispering the future through the past. And on that rain-soaked night, it was whispering to me. I arrived at St. Athanasius under a pewter sky that seemed reluctant to lift. The porter, a neat man with the kind of politeness that has long since congealed into habit, led me across the quad toward the refectory. The stone was still damp from the night's rain, and the echo of our footsteps felt indecent, as though sound itself should have been forbidden entry. Death, after all, prefers quiet company. The refectory smelled faintly of wax and old books. That blend peculiar to Oxford, where knowledge and decay share a tenancy. The table had not yet been cleared. A line of candlesticks, half-melted, traced its length like a procession arrested mid-prayer. At the head of the table, a chair remained pulled slightly back, and before it a glass of port stood unfinished. The liquid was darker than wine, viscous, the sort of thing men drink when they wish to feel wiser than they are. Professor Blythe had been found there, slumped forward, his head resting near his plate. Lewis told me that the doctor had certified heart failure. He said it with that mixture of relief and uncertainty, peculiar to men who hope not to see the word poison in a report. I told him heart failure was an accommodating phrase. It covered almost anything that should not have happened. It was then I noticed the hymnal beside the plate, its pages open, not by chance, but placed with intention. Psalm 130. De profundis clamavi ad te, Domine. Out of the depths I have cried unto thee, O Lord. Someone had underlined the verse in a fine blue pen. Blythe's, perhaps, or someone else's prayer. I've always distrusted coincidences of faith. Dr. Elspeth Harrow, the warden, entered soon after, poised, immaculate, the sort of woman whose restraint passes easily for kindness. She spoke softly, as if her words might disturb the memory of the dead man more than his death itself. Blythe had, she said, appeared distracted all evening, though nothing out of character. He had raised a toast, to truth even when inconvenient, and smiled that weary smile of his. Then silence, then collapse. The others had thought he'd fainted. It was only when his hand brushed the candle and sent a trail of wax down his sleeve that anyone realized. I listened, watching her eyes. They were dry, too dry for someone who had dined beside the man an hour before his death. She mentioned the psalm as though recalling a menu item. I asked how it came to rest there. She said perhaps Blythe had placed it himself. He was sentimental about such things. Perhaps. But sentiment rarely arranges itself so neatly. When she left, I walked the length of the table, studying the places where conversation had once lived. An overturned salt cellar, a faint ring of port on the tablecloth, a knife angled oddly. All the usual detritus of intellect interrupted. Near Blythe's seat, the decanter caught the light. I turned it carefully. The stopper was not the original. Too small, too new. Someone had replaced it. Why? Perhaps in the chaos after his collapse, but I doubted it. Lewis, standing awkwardly by the doorway, asked if I wanted him to fetch the glass for fingerprinting. I said no, not yet. There are moments when haste feels vulgar. The truth, like sediment, must be allowed to settle before one disturbs it. Outside, as we crossed back into the quad, I heard the chapel bell strike 11. A single note, low and hollow, drifted across the stones. It reminded me of a funeral I'd once attended where the organist, too old to see properly, had played the wrong hymn. Nobody corrected him. There are times when error is kinder than accuracy. Before leaving, I turned once more toward the refectory. Through the half-open door, I could still see the candle beside Blythe's chair flicker, a small, stubborn pulse of light against the inevitable dark. I remember thinking then that the psalm, the candle, and the wine were not the paraphernalia of death, but of confession. Only I did not yet know whose. There is a certain quiet that follows death in academia. Not grief exactly, but the uneasy hush of a system momentarily disturbed. By the following morning, St. Athanasius had resumed its familiar rhythm. The chapel bell tolled. Students cycled past the gate, and somewhere behind a closed window, someone was lecturing on Plato. It was as though Professor Blythe had never existed, some, or worse, had merely resigned. Lewis and I met with the remaining fellows in the senior common room, chamber of brown leather, pipe smoke, and moral ambiguity. Dr. Quentin Dale, the mathematician, sat by the fire, his face half buried in a newspaper that wasn't being read. Across from him, Dr. Voss, the theologian, toyed with a sherry glass that had long since been emptied. Between them, Lydia Crane, the postgraduate student whose name had already surfaced in whispers, looked as if she wished the furniture might swallow her whole. The warden, Elspeth Harrow, introduced me with the clipped civility of a woman accustomed to controlling a room. I said little. In such gatherings, silence is a form of pressure. It draws truth toward it, like metal to a magnet. Dale spoke first, asserting that Blythe's death was unfortunate, but not surprising. He'd been drinking too much, sleeping too little, and carrying the guilt of his own temperament. A kind of intellectual heart attack, he said, as if the mind itself had simply refused to continue. Voss disagreed, gently of course, as theologians tend to. He suggested that Blythe had always courted tragedy, that he seemed drawn to the darker psalms, to the idea of confession without absolution. Horrow listened without expression, though I noticed the faintest flicker when Voss mentioned the psalms. She had been the one to find the hymnal, after all. I turned my attention to Miss Crane. She was younger than I expected, too pale for her age, with that particular fragility born not of innocence, but of knowing too much. She said she had admired Blythe, though she admitted he could be cruel. There was something almost rehearsed about her grief, like a student quoting a text she no longer believed in. When I asked whether she had seen him before the dinner, she hesitated just long enough to make the silence matter. Then she said yes, briefly. He'd stopped by her rooms to return a paper she'd written on Milton. It wasn't her words that interested me, but what followed, the way her hand traced the rim of her cup, the exact rhythm of 3 turns and a pause, as though counting something unseen. Guilt, perhaps, or fear disguised as recollection. Later, as we left, Lewis asked if I believed her. I said I wasn't sure. People lie most convincingly when the truth itself feels unbearable. The college grounds were damp, the air sharp with that mid-autumn scent of wet leaves and distant smoke. Somewhere in the quadrangle, a blackbird called, one of those sudden, lonely notes that seem to echo inside rather than out. I paused by the chapel steps and looked up. The stained glass above the door depicted St. Athanasius trampling a serpent beneath his heel. It was the serpent's eyes that caught me. Not evil, exactly, but patient. Inside the refectory again, the table had been cleared. The porter was polishing the candlesticks, his cloth moving in slow, careful circles. I asked if Professor Blythe had any particular rituals before the fellows' dinners. He nodded. Blythe always chose the wine. Himself always insisted on opening it personally. I asked whether he had done so this time. The porter frowned. No, he said. Not this year. The warden had brought the bottle down from the cellar herself. A small, unimportant fact, perhaps. But small things like dust in a shaft of light are what give shape to the unseen. As I walked back toward the gate, the bell struck noon. I found myself repeating Blythe's toast from the night before. To truth, even when inconvenient. A brave sentiment, though not a practical one. Oxford, for all its learning, has never been kind to those who insist on truth. It prefers shadows, polite, articulate ones, where sin and scholarship can dine together in peace. I have often thought that letters, particularly those unsigned, possess a cruelty that speech cannot match. Words written without ownership acquire a peculiar sharpness, like glass polished by time. The letter in question was handed to me by the college porter, folded twice, yellowing at the edges as if it had been waiting its turn to wound. He said it had been found among Professor Blythe's belongings, tucked not into a pocket or drawer, but slipped between the pages of an old lecture manuscript on Tacitus. It was Lydia Crane who had brought it down to the porter's office that morning, claiming she had discovered it while helping to sort through Blythe's papers. She had not read it, she said. Her tone suggested she wanted me to believe her. The note itself was written on heavy parchment, not the kind one finds easily now. The ink had bled faintly, as though handled with damp fingers. It contained only a single line, in a hand that managed to be both elegant and nervous: Fiat justitia, ruat caelum. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. Below it, no signature, only the faintest indentation, perhaps from a seal that had not fully taken. I've seen many such messages. Self-righteous, vengeful, desperate. But this one unsettled me more than most. Not for what it said, but for the rhythm of its lettering. There was a hesitation in the downstrokes, as though the writer had paused, reconsidered, and continued. Not rage, then, but regret. Lewis, ever practical, thought it a prank, the kind of undergraduate melodrama that surfaces after a scandal. He pointed out that the college had a Latin society, that phrases like this turned up on invitations to their annual dinner. I told him perhaps he was right, though I didn't believe it. There was intent in the phrasing, and something else. The use of caelum rather than kailos. The classical purists at St. Athanasius would have noticed such a deviation. Blythe certainly would have. Perhaps that was the point. We went to Blythe's rooms, high-ceilinged, untidy, smelling faintly of tobacco and damp paper. On his desk stood an empty wine-glass beside a heap of unopened correspondence. His shelves were lined with Latin texts, their spines weary from service. But it was the absence that struck me first, a missing gap where the Lewis and Short dictionary should have been. An indispensable companion to any classicist, yet nowhere to be found. The warden appeared at the doorway as if conjured by the thought. She asked whether we had found anything of interest, and I told her only that we had found much that was missing. She smiled without curiosity, a smile practiced enough to survive inquiry. I asked whether she recognized the phrase on the letter. Her eyes flickered, then steadied. Every scholar does, she said. Justice and ruin, hand in hand. After she left, Lewis found a small detail I had overlooked, a faint scent on the paper, something floral but subdued, perhaps lavender or old perfume. Not the kind a man would use. It lingered just long enough to become memory. I wondered then whether the note had come from affection or condemnation. Later that evening, I sat in my rooms and unfolded the letter again under lamplight. The ink, when held to the glow, revealed a partial watermark, Cranwell's of Bath. Fine stationery, discontinued decades ago. I remembered dimly that Elspeth Harrow's husband had once been a collector of such things. She had mentioned it at some dinner years ago, his obsession with preserving old papers, as though he feared time would forget him. I should have let the thought rest, but deduction has its own hunger. I reached for the crossword from that morning's Times. The clue I had been avoiding read, "Retribution unspoken, falling from above." 6. The answer, I realized with a weary smile, was heaven. When I returned to St. Athanasius the next day, the porter told me something else. That a woman had come early, before dawn, asking to see Blythe's rooms. He hadn't recognized her, but she'd carried herself like someone entitled to trespass. I asked what name she gave. He thought for a moment, then shook his head. None at all. I left the college with the letter folded inside my pocket. Rain had begun to fall again. soft, uncommitted. In the reflection of the wet flagstones, the chapel windows shimmered like a conscience disturbed. Oxford had resumed its silence, but beneath it the faint echo of a woman's pen still trembled, as if justice, once written, could never quite be unwritten. There are moments in an investigation when one feels less like a detective and more like a reluctant confessor, forced to listen to truths that no one has asked for, shaped by guilt that belongs to someone else. That afternoon was such a moment. The air had turned brittle with November's approach, the kind that numbs the fingers before the mind. I had agreed to meet Lydia Crane in her rooms off St. Aldate's, a lodging house once meant for widows of clergymen, now repurposed for postgraduate despair. She greeted me with a formality that belonged to another age. The kettle was already boiling, its whistle subdued beneath the low hum of traffic. I noticed the books on her desk. Paradise, Lost, a volume of Browning and Blythe's own annotated lecture notes on Ovid. The smell was of paper and lavender soap. She said she was surprised the police had any further interest in the matter. I told her surprise was a useful thing. It often revealed what people had prepared to conceal. We sat opposite each other, the window behind her casting thin light across her face. She had the habit of speaking as if addressing a room larger than the one she occupied, every phrase shaped for posterity. She spoke of Blythe with a curious tenderness, as one might speak of a ruin that still held beauty. He had been brilliant, cruel, impossible, a man who demanded devotion and despised those who offered it. She smiled faintly, as though ashamed of having cared for him at all. I asked what she had meant when she said the night of the dinner had been inevitable. She hesitated, then said only that Blythe had been expecting a reckoning. Not from others, but from himself. He had become frightened of the very intellect that once defined him. He'd told her recently that words were treacherous, that truth had no syntax. It sounded like something a dying man would say, though at the time neither of us knew he was already dying. I noticed her teacup trembling slightly in her hand. Not from fear, I thought, but from anger turned inward. When she placed it down, a ring of moisture marked the table, an accidental circle of confession. She quoted Milton then, quietly, as if for herself. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. It was the kind of line one remembers in youth, but understands only in loss. What struck me, though, was her phrasing. She altered it, subtly, replacing can make with has made. The mind has made a hell of heaven. It was a small shift, but it changed everything, no longer philosophical, but personal. Blythe had once corrected her for the same mistake in an essay I'd found among his papers. He'd written in the margin, "Milton knew better, Miss Crane." She had underlined it 3 times. When I asked about the note, "Fiat justitia ruat caelum," she looked away, toward the rain gathering on the window pane. She said Latin made her uneasy. It reminded her of classrooms and judgments she no longer believed in. I told her it reminded me of funerals. That earned the first true smile I'd seen from her, a small, fleeting curve that vanished as quickly as it came. Before leaving, I glanced again at the books on her desk. Paradise Lost lay open at Book 9, The Fall. The line marked in faint pencil read, "What can it then avail, though yet we feel strength undiminished?" I asked if she had chosen that passage or found it already marked. She said she couldn't remember. People rarely can when the past begins to rearrange itself. Outside, the air had turned darker, the streets reflecting a thin film of rain. I walked slowly toward the river, replaying her words in my mind. The misquoted, "Milton lingered like a faint dissonance, the kind that resolves only when one listens too closely." Somewhere between guilt and admiration, truth had lost its footing, and I, perhaps, had begun to lose mine. There are few objects more deceptive than a photograph. They promise permanence, but what they capture is only the illusion of truth, a single moment dressed as eternity. The porter had brought it to me that morning, wrapped carefully in brown paper as though it was something sacred. It had been unearthed from a forgotten drawer in the senior common room, the 1979 Fellow's portrait of St. Athanasius College. The photograph smelled faintly of mildew and polish, the odor of preservation. I laid it flat across my desk, brushed a thin film of dust from its glass, and studied it. 12 figures stood in orderly symmetry beneath the wisteria-clad facade of the college hall. All wore the same academic stiffness. Smiles practiced, hands folded, eyes squinting against the afternoon light. Yet what drew me wasn't their formality. It was the proximity. Professor Blythe sat at the center, of course. He had the self-assurance of a man who understood that intellect, like wine, should never be diluted. To his right stood Elspeth Harrow, younger then, softer in the features, her gaze not quite meeting the camera. Her hand rested, almost imperceptibly, on the arm of Blythe's chair. The gesture might have been innocent, had the hand not been so carefully withdrawn in later prints. In the version hanging in the refectory, that section of the photograph was cropped. Lewis leaned over my shoulder, pointing to a face I hadn't yet examined. Dr. Quentin Dale, the mathematician. Dale's expression was unguarded, a half-smile that seemed too broad for the occasion. He looked toward Harrow, not the camera. The photograph, I thought, recorded not a memory, but a geometry of resentment. I asked the porter whether anyone else had seen this copy. He shook his head. The print, he said, had been meant for the archives, but was misplaced years ago when the college underwent refurbishment. The archive room itself had flooded that same winter. Accidents have such convenient timing in Oxford. Later that afternoon, I brought the photograph to Harrow's office. She was seated beneath a portrait of the college's founder, a man whose painted expression suggested he'd never trusted posterity either. I placed the photograph on her desk without comment. She looked at it briefly, then at me, as though deciding which demanded more care. She said she had forgotten that photograph existed. I told her that forgetting is rarely the same as absence. Her eyes lingered on her younger self, and for a moment I saw something break through the armor of composure. Not guilt, but nostalgia, which is sometimes the same thing in a different suit. She said Blythe had been difficult even then, intolerable in his pursuit of excellence, and that she had admired him once. Only admired? I asked. She smiled, but it faltered at the edges. Admiration, she said, is a dangerous beginning. When I mentioned that the print in the refectory was cropped, she appeared neither surprised nor defensive. The college had wanted a smaller frame, she said, yet the frame on the wall had space to spare. I didn't press the point. People lie more gracefully when allowed the illusion of control. Outside her office, the corridor was quiet except for the faint buzz of the radiator and the echo of distant footsteps. Always the same echo, as if the college itself had learned to impersonate those who left it. I paused before the refectory's framed version, comparing it with the one in my hand. The absence of her hand changed the composition entirely. Without it, Blythe looked unclaimed, almost saintly. Back in my rooms, I took out the crossword folded beside my whiskey glass. The clue read, "Proof of affection hidden in composition. 5. I smiled at the coincidence. The answer was obvious. Photo. Proof, affection, composition, all words that belong to that frozen moment in 1979. But proof, I reminded myself, is rarely proof of truth. That night, as rain began again against the window, I placed the photograph in my drawer beside the anonymous letter. The two seemed to belong together. One a declaration, the other an apology. And somewhere between them, a silence that had lasted 40 years continued to whisper, waiting for someone to listen. It was one of those afternoons when the light seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, the diffused kind that softens stone and memory alike. I had returned to St. Athanasius with Lewis to examine the wine cellar, though neither of us expected revelation. Wine, like truth, is rarely stored in the open. The steward who let us down was a man of careful habits and limited imagination, which made him useful. He carried a torch, though the single bulb above the steps flickered weakly, revealing a narrow descent that smelled of damp oak and something faintly chemical. The shelves were orderly, each bottle marked with the precision of scholarship, vintage, provenance, donor. Even secrets in Oxford prefer to be catalogued. The steward explained that Professor Blythe had personally requested the 1952 Sandeman for the Fellows' dinner, a rare port reserved for ceremonial occasions. He had signed for it himself the previous week. I asked whether he had also drawn the bottle from the rack. The steward hesitated. "No," he said. Dr. Harrow had come down the morning of the dinner, insisting on selecting it herself. She'd told him Blythe was occupied with the menu and that she'd deliver the bottle to the kitchen. Lewis caught my glance. That silent exchange that passes between those who've begun to suspect too soon. I thanked the steward and asked if any other bottles had been disturbed. He pointed to a small gap on the lower shelf, an absence marked by dust's interruption. Crouched to examine it. The label beside the empty space read, Sandeman, 1952, reserve stock. The handwriting, I noticed, was not the steward's. Its slant was narrower, more deliberate. A woman's hand, perhaps. There was a lingering scent near the vacant shelf. Faint, bitter, not unlike crushed leaves. Digitalis has no odor, but the imagination does what chemistry cannot. I straightened slowly, feeling the old ache in my leg, and listened to the distant hum of the college above us. A single drop of water fell from the ceiling onto the stone floor. It sounded like punctuation. Lewis, practical as ever, began noting the inventory numbers while I let my gaze wander across the rows. In one corner stood a crate of unlabeled bottles, remnants from a forgotten donation. On top of it lay an envelope, yellowed and half open. Inside, a folded sheet, the minutes of a fellows' meeting from 2 years earlier. Nothing remarkable at first glance, until I saw a small annotation beside Blythe's name. In absentia. Travel to Italy. Reason undisclosed. I remembered then a comment Harrow had made in passing, that Blythe's great vice was not drink, but solitude. She had said it fondly, though I wondered now whether solitude had been the disease or the cure. Italy, abstinence, and now a poisoned port. The alignment was too elegant for coincidence. When we emerged from the cellar, the afternoon light seemed harsher, less forgiving. Lewis asked whether I thought Harrow capable of such deceit. I told him capability is rarely the question. It's permission we seek, from conscience or from circumstance. The college gate clanged behind us as we stepped into the quadrangle. A group of students were rehearsing a choral piece under the arcade, their voices rising in imperfect harmony. One of them stumbled over a line, and the correction came too quickly, too precise. I stopped. That, I said quietly, is how one hears guilt, not in what's wrong, but in how swiftly it tries to make itself right. Lewis didn't understand, though he nodded as if he did. He suggested we stop by the lab to have the port residue analyzed. I said yes, though I knew what the results would tell us. They'd confirm only what the cellar already had, that someone had tampered with the bottle before it ever reached the table. That night, back in my flat, I poured myself a modest measure of whiskey. No Sandeman, but honest enough. The radio murmured a Bach concerto I half remembered. I thought of Harrow descending the cellar steps alone, her torch beam trembling against the shelves, the echo of her own breath for company. I thought of the note's Latin injunction. Let justice be done though the heavens fall. Perhaps she had believed she was obeying it. Or perhaps, as with most acts of justice, it had been only another form of revenge. Either way, the wine had answered for her. The trouble with evidence, I've always thought, is that it never quite behaves. It insists on meaning something before you're ready to listen. By the time we had the laboratory report, confirmation that the residue in the decanter contained digitalis, the narrative had already written itself in the minds of those eager for closure. Dr. Quentin Dale. His name had a satisfying neatness to it, the sort of symmetry that pleases bureaucracy, motive, means, opportunity, all seemingly in alignment. He'd been the most vocal in his contempt for Blythe, had the chemistry background to identify the poison and, as Lewis put it, looked the part. Oxford loves its villains polished, articulate, slightly tragic. Dale fit perfectly, but I've learned that perfection in such matters is usually a sign of deceit, not by the suspect, but by the story itself. We called him to the lodge, where he arrived with a composure that bordered on insolence. He listened as Lewis read the report aloud, his gaze wandering instead toward the stained glass window behind us. St. Athanasius in eternal triumph over his serpent. He smiled faintly, as if recognizing an old joke. He said he hadn't poisoned Blythe. He admitted, almost proudly, to sending the Latin note. It was, he explained, a rebuke rather than a threat. Justice, not vengeance. He'd discovered Blythe's plagiarism of a dead colleague's research and wanted him publicly shamed, not dead. Lewis asked why he hadn't come forward sooner. Dale replied that truth in Oxford was like wine, best kept in the dark until it matures. I almost admired the phrasing, though I suspected he'd rehearsed it. Still, there was something oddly genuine in his defiance. He was guilty of arrogance, certainly, but not of murder. When he left, Lewis muttered that it was all too convenient. I agreed, but not for the same reason. Convenience, I told him, isn't the hallmark of guilt. It's the camouflage of innocence. What troubled me wasn't Dale's story, but the silence surrounding it. He had spoken of the note's Latin phrase as though it had been his creation. Yet the version found in Blythe's papers used a subtle variation. Fiat iustitia, ruat caelum, the classical I instead of J. Only someone steeped in tradition, not irony, would make that choice. Harrow's Latin was precise. Dale's, I suspected, ornamental. That evening I returned to the college on a pretext. The porter let me into Blythe's rooms, where the scent of dust and extinguished candles lingered. On the desk lay a small pile of mail yet to be collected by the estate. Among the envelopes, a half-finished letter caught my eye, addressed but unsent. The handwriting was Blythe's, though uncharacteristically untidy. The addressee, Elspeth Harrow. I read only the opening line before guilt stopped me. De profundis clamavi ad te, Elspeth. The echo of the psalm from that night's dinner. The intimacy of it unsettled me more than the Latin itself. Whatever bound them had not been purely professional. I placed the letter back where I'd found it, though the knowledge had already done its damage. Outside, the college was hushed, except for the steady drizzle of rain against the quad. A lamp above the gate flickered, uncertain of its duty. In that wavering light, I caught sight of Lydia Crane crossing toward the chapel, her coat drawn tight, her head bowed. She disappeared through the side door reserved for fellows, a door she had no right to use. I thought of her misquoted Milton, her trembling hand, and wondered whose guilt she had chosen to carry. When I returned home, I found my crossword still unfinished. The clue I'd left unsolved days before waited patiently. False lead, first read, then misleading. 7. The answer came to me with unpleasant clarity. Decoy, a red herring indeed. Dale was never meant to be the villain. He was the distraction that guilt required to keep itself alive. Somewhere among the women of St. Athanasius, the scholar who edited a program too precisely, or the girl who quoted Paradise Lost as if it were autobiography. The real story waited, silent and immaculate. And like all stories in Oxford, it was one that preferred to remain untold. It was evening again when I found myself back at St. Athanasius, the hour when Oxford begins to exchange its scholars for ghosts. The quad was almost deserted, save for a few students moving between puddles, their umbrellas like drifting black petals. The porter let me in without question now. Familiarity breeds a kind of reluctant intimacy. I had become part of the college's nocturnal furniture. The library occupied the oldest wing, a long vaulted chamber that smelled of dust, vellum, and something indefinably human. The rain traced soft fingers along the leaded panes, and the lamps glowed with that honeyed fatigue that comes only after decades of service. Blythe's desk stood near the far window, overlooking the cloister garden. The same desk where he had once lectured and later, perhaps, written his final confession. I had returned because of a single detail, a sentence in the steward's report that had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. He'd written that the window by Blythe's place had been found unlatched that night, though all others were sealed. It might have been nothing, yet in Oxford, nothing rarely remains so. I examined the latch. Small, ornamental, recently polished. The rain outside distorted the view of the garden beyond, where the cobblestones glistened like submerged coins. From that angle, one could see directly into the refectory windows below, where the fellows' dinner had taken place. I stood there imagining it, Blythe raising his glass, unaware that above him another hand, steady and unobserved, was pouring from a decanter into his own. Lewis arrived then, carrying the results from the forensic tests. Digitalis, he said again, this time with the weary certainty of a man who no longer expects surprises. He wanted to discuss dosage and opportunity, but I was listening to something else, the faint whistle of air through the imperfect pane. It was a sound easily mistaken for wind, but it came from the outside in, not the reverse. Someone had opened it recently and carelessly refastened it. I told Lewis to look at the sill. He bent down, muttering about how he'd never understand why I preferred dust to evidence. But there it was, a faint half-moon mark of glass, the base of a bottle, perhaps, placed briefly on the ledge before being lifted away. Not proof, merely the echo of an act. I looked again at the desk. Among the scattered papers lay a half-finished crossword, folded once, as if in hesitation. The clue Blythe had left unsolved read, "Window of truth, admitting light or deception." 6. I filled it in silently. Aspect, truth or illusion, the same word, serving both. We left the library together, but I lingered at the door, drawn by the reflection of the rainlight against the pane. Through it, I could see the faint figure of Dr. Harrow crossing the quadrangle below, her umbrella tilted at an angle too careful to be unconscious. She moved with that same composure she had shown throughout, the calm of someone who has already decided what truth they can live with. Later, in her office, she spoke of Blythe again, this time with an almost tender precision. She said she'd gone to the cellar that morning because she wanted to surprise him, that the vintage had been his favorite, that she'd meant to remind him of better years. I asked whether she had also meant to remind him of Psalm 130. Her face changed slightly, like a photograph caught in uneven light. She said some words cling to us long after we've stopped believing them. When I stepped back into the night, the rain had stopped. The sky above the spire was clearing, not blue, not yet, but lighter. The window in the library glowed faintly behind me, one square of warmth against the stone. And I thought then, not for the first time, that Oxford is a city built on reflection, on the surfaces of water, on glass, on memory. We study what we see through it, and we call it truth, though it is always the light that deceives us most. It was late when I returned to the college for the final time. The porter had long since gone to his quarters, leaving the lodge unlit except for a single lamp above the gate. Rain had begun again. Not the confident rain of storms, but the soft, repetitive kind that seems to imitate thought. I remember thinking it would be a good night to forget things, though forgetting is never the same as forgiving. Dr. Harrow had agreed to meet me in the chapel. Her message had been brief, almost curt. There are matters better spoken than written. I found her standing near the altar, the candlelight tracing the faint gold threads in her hair. The smell of wax and damp hymnals hung in the air. Outside, the wind brushed lightly against the stained glass, and for a moment the colors on the floor trembled. She began without preamble. Blythe had been dying, she said. A heart condition he refused to acknowledge, an arrogance that would not yield to mortality. He had intended to resign, to leave the college quietly after the dinner. But he had also planned to destroy her, letters, rumors, half-truths arranged with the precision of revenge. He wanted to make her pay for what she had once withheld, affection, perhaps forgiveness. It was difficult to tell which mattered more to him. She said she had gone to the cellar that morning with the intention of replacing the vintage. She had meant to humiliate, not to harm, to give him a taste of his own decay. The port, she said, was her symbol, not her weapon. She had added a small amount of the digitalis solution from the infirmary. Enough, she thought, to sicken him, not to kill. She had wanted to see him weakened, made small in front of those who had adored him. When she stopped speaking, the silence was almost devout. The chapel's great clock ticked twice before I answered. I told her there is no such thing as measured cruelty. That intention is merely vanity in disguise. She smiled faintly at that. You of all people should understand, she said. Justice never comes clean. Lewis would have called it a confession, but I wasn't certain it was one. Her tone was not apologetic, nor proud, something between resignation and relief. I asked whether Blythe had known she would do it. Her eyes moved toward the stained glass window depicting the Annunciation. She said he had invited her to destroy him. That the note, the psalm, even the choice of wine, had all been part of his final orchestration. I didn't know if I believed her, though belief seemed beside the point. When she turned to leave, she paused by the door and said she had written to Lydia Crane. She wanted the girl to leave Oxford, to escape what she called the contagion of intellect without mercy. Lydia, she said, had loved Blythe too, though she would never have admitted it. I thought of the misquoted Milton, of that faint trembling of her hands, and wondered if love and guilt were ever distinct things. I stayed behind after Harrow left. The candle flames shivered each time the wind pressed against the chapel door. I sat in the back pew, notebook unopened, whiskey forgotten at home. Above me, the carved faces of saints stared down in patient incomprehension. I thought of the psalm again. Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord. Perhaps confession is nothing more than the sound of that cry before it is heard. Later, I walked out into the quadrangle. The rain had stopped. The air was sharp, transparent. From somewhere beyond the library, I could hear the faint sound of a piano. Hesitant, unresolved chords, like a student practicing without conviction. I stopped beneath the window where I had once seen Harrow's silhouette. The candle was gone. Only darkness remained, perfectly symmetrical. Lewis would file his report the next day. The cause of death would remain unaltered. Cardiac failure, natural causes, though neither of us believed in nature anymore. Harrow would resign quietly, the college would mourn discreetly, and Oxford would go on reflecting itself in puddles of rain as if nothing had happened. I sometimes think of Blythe when I pour my evening whiskey, of his unfinished crossword, the psalm, the wineglass beside his hand. He had wanted truth even when inconvenient. He got something rarer, understanding deferred. Justice, perhaps, postponed to an hour none of us will see. And so the case, like most of them, ended not with revelation, but with fatigue. The kind that arrives when the mind has finally exhausted its questions, but the heart, damn it, has not. It has been some months since the case at St. Athanasius closed, though I am not sure closure is the right word. Some things do not end. They simply lose the will to continue. The college resumed its rhythm soon enough, the corridors once again echoing with the sound of lectures and polite applause. Only occasionally does the chapel bell falter, as if remembering what it once tolled for. I was there again this evening, though not in any official capacity. Habit, I suppose. Or curiosity, that lesser form of devotion. The porter, a little older, recognized me and said the fellows were holding evensong. I nodded, though I didn't go in immediately. I walked first through the quad, where the flagstones were slick from rain, and the wisteria along the hall wall had begun to turn brittle. From the refectory windows came the faint chime of glass on glass. A dinner, perhaps, or some anniversary too minor to note in the mail. Inside the chapel, the candles had already been lit. Their light trembled across the pews like memory over water. I took my seat near the back, where one can still hear the choir without seeing the faces. The psalm that evening was one I recognized. De profundis clamavi ad te, Domine. Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord. The sound of those words carried differently now, not as confession, but as endurance. I remembered Blythe slumped over his plate, Harrow's steady eyes, Lydia's misquoted Milton. Each had called to their own heaven, and each had been answered in silence. When the service ended, I stayed behind as the verger extinguished the candles one by one. The scent of burnt wick filled the air, faintly sweet, faintly final. Only the smallest flame remained, a single taper left burning near the altar. He said he always left one lit, out of tradition. I told him tradition was just memory dressed in order. He smiled, not understanding, and left me to the quiet. I approached the altar and watched the remaining flames sway in the draught. It illuminated the brass plaque beneath it. To those who sought truth and found it unbearable. No date. No names. Just that. It might have been written for all of us. Outside, the city was beginning to blur into night. The streets shimmered faintly under the mist, and somewhere beyond the high, a lone bus changed gears, its sound fading into the distance like a sigh withheld. I paused at the gate and looked back. Through the chapel window, the candles still burned, small but persistent. I thought of the crossword Blythe had left unfinished, the last clue still circled in faint pencil. I had solved it weeks later, long after the case was filed away. The clue had read, Mercy found in the final light, 6. The answer had been simple enough, candle. I don't know whether Blythe had chosen it deliberately, or whether coincidence had simply grown poetic in his absence. But as I walked away from the college that night, I knew the difference no longer mattered. Oxford behind me, rain ahead, and somewhere in between, the faint warmth of that solitary flame. It burned, not for the dead, nor for the living, but for the small, stubborn hope that knowledge need not always lead to ruin. Somewhere, I imagine, Elspeth Harrow reads in silence, Lydia Crane writes without signing her name, and the porter still locks the refectory door with a reverence he cannot explain. And I, as always, pour myself a measure of whiskey, sit before a crossword I may never finish, and wait for the candlelight to find me again.